Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the ResearchWise, it is my privilege to warmly welcome you all to today's academic panel discussion on the theme Recognizing Women's Work, Unpaid Care, Labor Market, and the Indian State. My name is Devi Krishna. I'm a doctoral fellow at IIPS Mumbai, and I'll be moderating today's session with all the communication and background technical support from Deekshan Bhailot and Shantanu Singh. I hope I'm audible. Can somebody?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, thank you. At the outset, I would like to sincerely thank each one of you for joining us today. We are very much delighted to share that we have received more than 300 registrations from across the country, including faculty members, students, policy professionals, etc. We also extend a special note of thanks to participants, those who could not join us due to the time constraint and requested recording, which will be shared with you all. And a special thanks also goes to the faculty from IIPS, TISS, and JNU for their encouragement and support. Before we begin, a brief note on the ResearchWise. The ResearchWise is a growing policy think tank and research consultancy platform working at the intersection of demography, public policy, and social development across multiple disciplines within the social sciences. Our core objective is to strengthen academic and policy engagement through panel discussions, expert lectures, and capacity building programs that focus on data literacy, analytical skills, and the development of a scientific temperament, particularly among the early career researchers. Our work spans several verticals, including research and policy analysis, capacity building programs, data literacy initiatives, academic training, public health research, and evidence-based policy research. Through these initiatives, we aim to contribute to informed policy discourse and strengthen the research policy interface in India. I request either Deekshant or Shantanu to drop the link to our website in the chat so that you can look it up later. Let's moving on to the theme of today's discussion, which is extremely timely and significant. More so when we consider the fact that we are commemorating a bit delayed the International Working Women's Day, so we could not have selected a better topic for this occasion. So when we talk about women's work, we often default to what is visible, which is the employment, wages, and participation in the labor market. But a significant portion of women's contributions remain invisible, uncounted, and undervalued, particularly the care work. Globally, we did observe the largest systemic economic shift in the last century. Some even would go and say that women started working in the 1960s. But the reality is women always worked. They did not just go to work in the 1960s or during the Second War, but women have always worked. What has happened was the shift in their jobs that represented a gigantic social and economic shift, where half of the population moved majority of their work from home to the market. So we went from one economic system to another without really being aware of it. Yet, this economy seems to be a second economy. Or in the same way, women are defined or women are often considered as second sex, as Simone de Beauvoir mentions it. There is a second economy where the work that is traditionally carried out by men is what counts, and it defines the economic worldview, and women's work is often considered as the other. In fact, when I was reading Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, I just realized that the so-called home economics that we gloriously attribute to Gary Becker has its root even in the works of Margaret Reed and Hazel Kirk, whom nobody bothers to remember, because we even attribute those theories also to the Chicago School. Even in India, the time use surveys and labor data repeatedly show that women spend disproportionately higher time in unpaid work, while their participation in the formal labor force remains comparatively low. So this raises certain important questions. What counts as work in our economic and policy frameworks? Why is it that the unpaid care work is excluded from traditional measures like GDP? Or is there any way where we can include these measures, these unpaid care work, into our traditional measures? And more importantly, what are the consequences of this invisibility for women's economic independence, well-being, and agency? At the same time, we must also examine labor market itself, because even when women enter paid work, they often face segregation into low-paying or informal sectors. They face wage gaps, they face motherhood penalties, they face limited social protection, which all brings us to the role of the Indian state or the state itself. So It is quite sophomoric to assume that the state has not done anything because over the years, policies did attempt to address these gaps through maternity benefits, self-help group mobilizations, and employment schemes. But we do have to ask whether these interventions did its job, or are these interventions enough, and are they addressing the root causes? So today's discussion is an excellent opportunity to bring together these threads about recognition, redistribution, and representation, and also to critically reflect on how we can move toward a more equitable system that values all forms of work. I hope this question, or I hope this whole conversation, will not only unpack the challenges, but also explore pathways for change. Let me briefly share the structure of today's panel. We have inaugural opening remarks by the member of our advisory board, Professor Uday Shankar Mishra from IIPS. And then we would have remarks by all panelists, 3 of them. Then finally, we'll open for question and answer. I also request all the participants to kindly keep their microphones muted during the panel discussion, and you may share your questions in the chat box and we'll select them during the segment. Before we begin the panelists' introductions and their remarks, it is my privilege to invite Professor Uday Shankar Mishra, professor at IIPS Mumbai, who has joined us for this discussion. Professor Mishra's constant guidance and encouragement have been a great support and inspiration for all of us, and we are truly honored to have his presence with us today. So may I request you to kindly share your opening remarks. Over to you, Professor Mishra.
Thank you, Devi, and thanks to the ResearchWise team to have given me this opportunity to initiate the discussion. In fact, I must say that recognition of women's work, and on a particular event of Women's Day, which is celebrated on March 8th, and as you mentioned, we are conducting this particular panel discussion on the eve of that event, and as well as I also expressed that on 3 counts, I would like to introduce this particular panel discussion topic of today. First of all, let me appreciate the 3 esteemed panelists who have joined us, who have done extraordinarily significant amount of work and contribution to this area of discourse that we are having today. And to begin with, let me start that why that there is a wake-up call to in recognition of women's work. The wake-up call is not about the kind of statistics that is displayed from time to time as to the kind of bias that is there in not recognizing or overlooking or ignoring women's women role in the workspace at large. So first of all, there are variety of information which come by to give evidence to this fact that why recognition of women work is important and why recognition of women work has to be prime at this point in time. And this has 3 angularities. The first is the kind of evidence that is coming through with relation to the contribution of women work in assessment of economic growth in terms of contribution and productivity. The second is that what kind of prevailing structure which remains when it comes to women work, whether or not there is a systemic bias in terms of reading women's work in different components of it. And finally, it is not merely the recognition. I came across a good paper where it talks about 3 R's of this. It starts with recognition, and from recognition to redistribution and reduction. To provide certain bit of evidence to this fact, the most recent discourse which has actually ignited this discussion more strongly is the time use information between men and women, which are available all over the world, and that comparisons are made across countries, in which we find that time spent by Indian women on unpaid domestic and care work was more than 8 times than that of men and higher than most other countries. So this is one exclusively a distinct thing in India which needs to be noted. And then females between 15 to 59 years spend 305 minutes a day on such work, recording a marginal decline of 315 minutes from the last round of the survey. In fact, these evidences finally boils down to an assessment which is available in literature, which is very stark, in the sense that the estimated economic values of women's unpaid domestic work ranges from 15% to 17% of India's GDP. Now, I come down to the kind of women's work participation in different sectors. And when we talk about sectoral distribution, there are 4 or 5 features in which these biases are completely apparent. When we talk about women's work, it should be compared between agriculture and non-agriculture. It should be in terms of regularity of employment, in terms of the divide between formal and informal, in terms of the earning of women workers, and finally, the educational characteristics of women workers. In fact, in all these 5 dimensions that I indicated, it will be very, very stark to see that the biases will be apparent, and also the evidence doesn't need to be gathered, because it has been any improvement that we see in work participation at large, these biases continue to widen rather than narrowing down. And finally, coming down to this aspect of recognition, redistribution, and reduction, in fact, recognition component of women's work is very well known. Recognition of women's work has been sounded out in terms of as an economic activity, as a productive activity, and also the very normative that is actually given out in terms of the altruistic behavior of women work, altruistic aspect of women work, and women's work being considered as something which is normative. And in that, a major part is actually the care work. And going from recognition to redistribution, the redistribution highlights that how can the work that is actually especially focused or especially concentrated or burdened on women could be shared, and that sharing could perhaps become better not in terms of distribution between men and women and other members or everybody else in the society, but state has a very significant role to play, the kind of policies that they implement where this redistribution could take place. And ultimately, it is a reduction, because reduction of women's work can only be facilitated when there are institutions, there are kind of forms of different interventions which can be brought in, where women's work, even if it is completely necessary when it comes to maternity, when it comes to childcare, can also be shared and can also be eased out. So given this kind of a preliminary understanding of recognition of women's work, I am very pleased and I'm excited to hear the 3 distinguished panelists of today who have done sufficient and significant amount of work in this area, which will definitely educate us and also inform the larger crowd of participants in this panel discussion, where this discussion will lead to some kind of a policy derivative at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mishra. In fact, as we elaborated on the 5 dimensions that we have to consider, it kind of reminds us the importance of having an intersectional lens when we look at women's labor force participation. I also feel that, as you mentioned about the altruistic attitude, often the policies that our government or any government has kind of has an implicit assumption about women being altruistic, whether or not they want it, but the policies do have an implicit assumption about that. And I'm sure our panelists will dwell more on the points you have laid out. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Moving on, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists for today's session. We'll be first listening from Professor Ritu Devan. Professor Ritu is the president of the 64th Conference of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, visiting professor at the Institute of Human Development and co-founder of the Feminist Policy Collective. She was also the first ever woman director of the Department of Economics, University of Mumbai, and the founder member of the first Center for Gender Economics in Asia. Her research on labor, gender inequality, agrarian distress, and inclusive growth has influenced policy debates across India. She continues to advocate evidence-based approaches to equitable development. Her insights bridge academia and real-world challenges faced by marginalized communities. She has over 250 publications, including 56 books and monographs, encompassing a wide range of issues, including development economics, gender studies and gender economics, rural and urban development, infrastructure, labor markets, peace studies, etc. She was a member of the Feminist Economics Group for engendering the 12th and 11th 5-year plans, as well as of the subgroup on gender and macro policies appointed by the Planning Commission, Government of India. She is also a consultant to UNDP, UN Women, ILO, World Bank, and Asian Development Bank. Some of her recent books include Invisible Work, Invisible Workers, the Sub-Economies of Paid and Unpaid Work, Demonetization from Deprivation to Destitution, and Pandemic, Patriarchy and Precarity, Labor, Livelihood, and Mobility Rights. It is an honor to have Professor Ritu with us. Thank you once again, ma'am, for joining us. We are excited to listen. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. First of all, apologies for my throat. I have this crazy infection I picked up when I was touring the Northeast for lectures, and it's just not gone. So please put up with this terrible voice. I was really very, very happy to be here because when you sent me the concept note research-wise, I was very impressed because it takes into account a huge amount of issues and issues which are not really dealt with, which become, the nuances component of it. At a broader level, of course, we know what we're talking about. But the nuances which you picked up were really very, very exciting, and something which really does not take place, any debate take place at the public sphere. Professor Mishra has in fact laid out major of the issues in a very succinct kind of a manner. So thank you very much for that. What also I was really very happy about when I read the concept note, that this is one of the very, very few, I think, separations which have taken place where when we talk about care work, unpaid care work, generally it's all lumped together. But here you have separated it into domestic and into unpaid care work, which I thought was extremely important. There's a lot to say, and I have an amazing panel, and Nalini's there, Radhika's there, and they've done excellent work on this. Now, for me, the issues are several, and I will try and put them together in about 10 or 12 minutes, whatever time we have. But if I go a minute here and there extra, please forgive me, because there's just so much to say. One is that, we are very worried as economists, men, women, and of course, those who are part of advocacy and action, at the global rankings where India is falling consistently. I think across all SDGs, whether it's water or environment and women, of course, we know that the global gender gap, we've fallen to 140 out of 156. And very sad that women's economic participation and health, we are 142 out of 146. So for me, this increase which is taking place in the last 2 or 3 years of female work participation rates is something which is extremely debatable. Now, for me, the entire link, there's a continuum which exists. There's paid work, there's unpaid work, and there is an aspect which we never really talk about, and that is the underpaid component. In fact, I don't see any policy ever on the unpaid component which is there. So fundamentally, 3 kind of activities which women and of course men also do. I don't think we can separate when we talk about gender sensitivity, we take all these into account. There are 3 kinds of activities, some which are recognized, partly not recognized, at a broader theoretical conceptual level. One is clear, income earning. Okay, that's very clear. You're in paid employment. Definition is clear, but how it is articulated in the Indian labor market is something quite different. I will come to that later. So which is paid and also the underpaid component. Second is the income augmenting, that you are not directly involved in paid labor, but you are helping increase the income of the family. Of course, we're talking of the majority who are, at the lower levels. So where the work is unpaid and partly recognized, if you see 92, 93, etc. in the codes. The third, which is fully unrecognized, is what I call income substituting. And that is where women's labor comes in very, very, very strongly. Absolutely unpaid and absolutely unrecognized. Now, when we talk about the paid labor market, and my confusion or criticism actually starts from the paid labor, and what we are talking about is paid labor. and the fundamental contradictions where that is concerned before coming to the unpaid kind of a calculation or component or resolution or whatever we may call it. So we have three categories of paid work, which is given. You have your regular work, casual work, and self-employment. Right? Casual work is clear. I think that on a daily basis, etc., etc. So there's a lot of confusion between what is casual work and what is gig work. These days, gig and platform is talked about a lot, but the two are very different. Gig is different and platform is different. So do gig workers come into casual or not is one point of debate. Second is self-employment, which is equated in a very hopeful manner to entrepreneurship, okay, which we know is not correct. Self-employment, primarily its own account, and it is primarily one individual working for the family, not employing. The employment levels are very, very minimal. 5 or 6% are employers, but primarily own account. And the biggest category in the self-employment aspect is of unpaid family workers. And my confusion arises from the fact that should unpaid family helpers be counted as workers at all? So really, our labor force participation rate, if we take out the unpaid component, becomes much, much lower than what it is touted at about 38 or 39% today. Even among regular workers should really be the clearest of all in many ways. But regular workers themselves, they now has emerged. And that's why I'm so glad you mentioned the labor codes. Now, this is something I've been working on for 6 years. And at the ground level, at the legal level, at, of course, theoretical, conceptual, analytical level, etc., etc. Now, the PLFS includes regular workers as workers. That is your periodic labor surveys. All right. Regular workers. Now, whether the quality of work is good or not, whether they get paid leave, security, written contract, that is a different kind of an issue. Now comes the labor code, which says, and I'm reading out the definition, he recognizes many of the so-called regular workers as workers because it defines an employee or worker as one who works in an establishment or industry where there are a minimum of 5 workers. This code on wages is defining for all the other codes, which are there, codes 2, 3, and 4. And therefore, it becomes a fundamental and the most important component. So now, according to law, okay, one is your PLFS data. Second is your law, which gives a totally different definition. Now, under the code on wages, on what is a regular worker, and now who it keeps out as regular workers. So now, out of the regular workforce, as recognition, legal recognition, are all your platform workers, gig workers, however you may define them, domestic workers, home-based production workers, all your scheme workers, Asha, Anganwadi, Narega. Now, of course, Narega has gone into a different name, which is there. Your auxiliary nurses, apprentices. There's a long list which we have drawn legally and, of course, even otherwise, of those who are kept out. And this absurd categories, I cannot understand how anyone can have these categories as workers. Drone Didi, Bhojan Mata, Pashu Sakhi, Bank. I mean, are these economic categories? It's just so. Anyway, all of them are out of the definition of code on wages. In the code of wages, one aspect which is impacting, okay, and it's been implemented in almost all, I think about 18 states have implemented the labor codes, particularly the code on wages. And your imbalance between paid and unpaid, underpaid is a different issue. Paid and unpaid work is shaken up by what is defined as the minimum hours of work in your code of wages. 8, which is internationally acceptable, and India has signed that covenant of 8 hours a day. It has gone up to 10. In some cases, it has gone up to 12. And there were 3 states which had asked for, and fortunately, though it is there in the codes, but fortunately the Supreme Court cut it down. 16 hours of work per day. All right. For spread over, emergency, exports, etc., etc. There are several reasons when a worker can be asked to work for 16 days. So therefore, you have more of a paid component, not in terms of money, but in terms of time. And you're going to have less for unpaid. So that balance or that equilibrium just goes. Also, what the code of wages does, and these are offshoots, I think, which we really need to take into account, is the way it calculates wages. All right. One man is a full consumption unit, what we call a CU. A woman is 0.8 consumption units. Now, why a woman needs less nutrition than a man, I'm not saying more, though she does a huge amount of unpaid work, but at least equal. So that definition of wages is something which is going to impact and is already impacting the wage code. There are many other inequalities which I'm not going to, we can maybe discuss them in detail later. Certainly gender-based wage inequalities, certainly caste-based, your SC and your ST, and your new emerging in the last 3 years. I'm not romanticizing the past and say it never existed earlier. But today, the discrimination against Muslim workers has reached the extent of 70%. And I think that aspect we have to take into account where paid is concerned. Now, unpaid, if paid is so unclear, unpaid is even more unclear. Okay, obviously, because it is not recognized, it is not valued. You have your codes of 91, 92, 93, which we are all extremely familiar with. But the separation, and which is what I liked very much also in your concept note, the separation between domestic unpaid work and domestic unpaid care work. Okay, so your domestic work includes, and these are 2 different fundamental types of work, and therefore the resolutions will also be somewhat different. So in your unpaid domestic, you have your standard water and energy issues which are there, and several others which are linked to this, fodder, etc., which is not care work, which is domestic income augmenting and income substituting work. The care work component is also not a homogeneous lot. There's elderly, there's disabled, physically challenged people, and children, what is seen as care. And here, I just want to say 2 things. One is that let us not see children as children, and therefore see them as the future workforce. All right. Now, if they are the future workforce, the state positively has a role in looking after the quality of the future workforce of India, not only as children, but as what we call, who are going to become the demographic dividend at a broader level. The issues also come up is how much of time, and we are familiar with the time use study data of 19 and 18, and how in fact some work has actually increased, not only for women, but also for men. I think that is something we have to really take into account. And that is the kind of women's time or the difference between rural and urban. And that's something, in fact, which Professor Mishra pointed out in his opening remarks, is that rural and urban, there's a difference in the time spent on looking after children. And in fact, in all the field work which I have done, there's a standard statement. I've done it across maybe 10 or 15 districts, states of India, urban, rural, etc. put together. And the standard answer is, "Hamare bacche to sadak pe hi bade ho jate." You know, so the quality of care, the quality of food, etc. is an issue. Do I have 2 minutes more? And then I'll just conclude. So when we see the resolution and the role of the Indian state, we link it up also to an aspect which is not talked about in relation, very much in relation to the unpaid work and the income substituting and income augmenting work. And that is the role of the CPRs. That is your common property resources. That is so fundamental to rural women and also to some urban women who are on the outskirts. And there's some kind of rural agriculture involvement, even in urban, what is defined as urban areas. So therefore, you have huge changes in your Forest Rights Act. I'm not going to the details. There's a massive dilution which is taking place. Post-project clearance, post-facto clearance. Okay. And now I think it's the only country in the world which talks about non-geographical relocation of forests. All right. Now, what it does to women who spend and who depend a lot on CPRs for unpriced nutrition, for herbs, for medicines, for many, many other kinds of issues is one aspect. And therefore, what I see, of course, we are familiar with water and firewood. And currently, I'm just doing an analysis of the budget. It should be out, published next week, of how the budget is, in fact, increasing the unpaid work of women. Now, that's something which maybe at a later point, really, one can talk about. And therefore, the resolution which we talk, one is the redefinition. We already have reduction, redistribution, etc., etc. The 3 R's. The fourth, which we must look at, is the issue of redefining. All right. Now, redefining includes the very recent phenomena in India of replacing or rewarding women for their unpaid domestic work by giving them these so-called Behna schemes, this 1,000 and 2,000, etc., etc. There's a lot more to analyze within that, but this equation of, the unpaid and the Behna and the women's schemes or the freebies, which we know are linked in a political manner at many different kinds of ways. So the burden is not only double of paid and unpaid, it is what I call a triple burden, because the vacuum or the withdrawal from the concept of a welfare state, which does not invest in reducing the overall unpaid burden of not only women, but also men. And this, I would like to make it very clear that, the way data is presented and the way we talk about data is women do 8 times more than men, which we are familiar with. But the point is reducing the total burden. It's not a inter-household resolution. That the husband will wash 3 clothes and the woman will make 3 chapatis. That is not the resolution. The resolution has to be to reduce the total unpaid burden. And I think this came out so clearly during 2 recent policy changes, the role of men, the role of single migrant men in unpaid work, which is still not calculated properly. One is demonetization, what it did. And secondly is the less than empathetic pandemic policy, where if 1/3 of India is full of migrants, and majority, as we know, are male migrants. So their unpaid component also becomes a very fundamental issue. So therefore, it's not adjustment within the family. It's not mindset of men. And, that's not the point at all. The point is reducing the total for men and for women, more for women. And of course, men will also be affected. And my final question eternally is that even if unpaid work declines, where are the jobs? And this is something which I think the economic survey for the first time last year, it brought out that the increase in profits is much higher. In fact, the share of wages is actually declining and profit rates are actually increasing. And the biggest rise was during the pandemic. Okay, so if we see this entirely in the macroeconomic context and the role of the state within that, I think that when things become clearer, but they also become more complicated at the same time. Right, so much more to say, but I'll leave it for discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ritu, for sharing your insights from both data and from field, that too within time. I'm so glad that you did touch upon all those pandemic policy issues as well as the relocation of women and what comes with it. And personally, I'm looking forward to listening more about how, in fact, budget increase is increasing the unpaid work. I hope we have a discussion about that in the question and answer. If there are any questions for Professor Ritu, you can put those in the chat box now. We'll take them later. Moving on, we'll now listen from Professor Mrinalini. Mrinalini Jha is a professor of economics at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy in OP Jindal Global University. She also serves as the director of the Jindal Institute of Haryana Studies. Mrinalini is trained as an empirical development economist and is interested in issues of labor, gender inequality, inequality of opportunity, and structural transformation in the Indian society. She completed her PhD from Delhi School of Economics at University of Delhi and did a postdoc from the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. She has previously taught undergraduate and postgraduate students at the University of Delhi and at Azim Premji University. Welcome, Professor Mrinalini Jha, to today's panel discussion. Over to you.
Thanks, Devi. Is it okay for me to share my screen, please?
Yes, yes, of course.
Let me know when it's visible.
Yeah.
Can you see?
Not yet. No.
Let me try again. How about now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having me here. And you can see my screen, right?
I cannot see it now. Can anybody else see your screen, Pankaj?
No.
All right.
No.
Was it?
Yeah, it was visible a moment ago.
It was visible for a second and then gone.
How about now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm going to make this full screen. Just let me know if it stays like that, or else I'll just not make it full screen maybe. Is
Yeah,
it
sure.
fine now?
It's fine.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much for confirming. And thank you, Pankaj, for reaching out. It is a pleasure to be here. I do think we should have given Professor Diwan more time. There was so much more to learn. But what I will do is perhaps complement some of the specific aspects which she brought forth, especially about the unpaid female helpers, which has a category which has been...
Excuse me, Professor Mrinalini, the screen is not visible again. Maybe you can just keep it in, not in full screen, maybe. That would work, hopefully.
Okay, let's try that. Is it, yeah? Is it fine right now?
Yeah.
Let me know if you can, yeah, okay. So as I was saying, I'm going to stick to the unpaid family helpers part and try to understand what kind of role women are playing really in the employment story which has been emerging in India in the last 7 years. And Professor Diwan did allude to that there has been a rise in employment, but there are concerns on what kind of rise it has been and what it means specifically for women in the Indian workforce. I would want to begin by saying that I work with data. I'm trained as an empirical economist. And let's not question the fact that whether there has been a rise in employment or not, the way we measure employment, and this is, India collects fantastic data. Periodic Labor Force Survey has been a major source for a lot of research which we have been able to do. And employment numbers have been increasing. I want to put it out there. Unemployment has been falling. What does that mean? That's something that we need to now talk about. Given the diversity in the audience, I will try my best not to use any jargons, but happy to answer any questions if they come later. Okay, so I'll simply begin by looking at employment and population. So the idea is that, of course, working age population is increasing as we speak. How has employment been keeping pace with that? Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 time periods, and later I will just stick to 2017-18 onwards, but just bear with me for this one slide. I'm going to start from 1993-94 and go on up till 2004-5, and that's what I'm going to call phase 1. Now, in this phase one, what we saw was that employment was increasing, and the increase in employment was keeping pace with the increasing population. Okay, and that is fine, because that means that our labor force participation rate, which simply means the number of people who are either employed or are actively looking for work, that number stayed constant because the rise in employment was matching the rise in population. Come phase two, which is this phase between 2004-5 to 17-18, where in terms of quantity, this is really, the number of jobs, the increase in the number of jobs. This phase was actually the worst, because what we saw was that in absolute employment terms, and so absolute employment numbers, there was stagnation. There was no increase. But of course, as we know, the working age population continued to increase. And because of that, the labor force participation rate dropped to 52%. Phase three, which is the phase for which we have the latest data, this trend reversed. And that's what the celebration that you read in the newspapers is about, because the absolute employment levels were rising faster than the increase in working age population. So keep that in mind. Last phase, which is phase three, the employment numbers, the rise in employment was more than the rise in working age population. While in phase two, the previous phase, the trend was in the opposite direction. However, what is this employment that is getting generated? Because as we all would understand, typically you would think that if the economy is really growing, if there is a robust growth in the economy, that will lead to more demand-driven employment generation. There is a echo. I'm not sure if somebody's mic is on. Thank you. So one would expect that if there is growth in the economy, that will lead to demand-driven employment generation, right? And this demand-driven employment generation will actually look for productive employment. And productive employment is something which we understand as good quality jobs, that you are productively employed in that occupation, whatever that may be. Is that what's happening? Well, let's see. Very simple graph. What we have done is we have looked at 20 major states, okay, the most populous states. The x-axis measures the change in the state domestic product between 2017-18 and 22-23. Okay, so how has the state domestic product increased for the different states over time between this time period? And my y-axis is measuring the percentage change in female WPR, so workforce participation rate. And what do we see? We see a negative slope line, right? So what does that mean? What we are seeing through our data is that the rise in the female workforce participation rate is disproportionately more in those states which are seeing a lower growth in the state domestic product per capita. And that makes us wonder, what is the kind of job that these women are doing, right? So we then split these jobs into two kinds. What the first category is what Professor Diwan has been talking to us about, which is the unpaid female workers, right? Just for people to get a sense of who these women are, who these unpaid female workers are. Well, all my education has been from the University of Delhi, and we would all the time go out to have chai and, bhel puri and samosa and this and that. Now, the bhel puri that you have, the onions are chopped, the masala is ready, the potatoes are boiled, etc. And the bhaiya, always a bhaiya who sells this, is he doesn't do that all of it right there, right? He comes prepared. So who is doing that preparation? Well, perhaps his wife, his daughter, his sister, they're sitting at home. They do all of this before he leaves the house in the morning. And that's the unpaid labor that we're talking about, just to give you a sense of what we are meaning when we say unpaid female workers. Now, if you look at the same increase, the states which are seeing a greater increase in the state domestic product are seeing a lesser increase. That's the graph I'm talking about. A lesser increase in unpaid female workers. So look at Karnataka, which is here, versus a Bihar, which is here. So Bihar is seeing a much higher increase in unpaid female workers. However, a much lower increase in the share of salaried workers who are women. So what we are seeing is the states which are seeing a higher growth in SDP per capita are also seeing better quality jobs which are getting created as against the states who are not doing so well in their state domestic product. That was to give you an overview of what kind of jobs are getting created and how that is related to the economic growth that we are seeing across states. Now I'm going to borrow a quality lens, because in terms of quantity, remember, phase 3, which is 2017-18 onwards, was doing fantastically well, because we are seeing a rise in employment outpacing the rise in population, right? And phase 2, which was just before that, there what we saw was the rise in employment was stagnating, and population was increasing, right? But what about quality? I'm going to take two lenses, the first one being type of job. So again, Professor Diwan has alluded to it, that salaried job in our context is the most preferred job, all right? So, and that's, and we say that very cautiously because we understand it's a very heterogeneous group. The house help who comes to my home to, you know, for the dusting, cooking, cleaning, is also a salaried work. I'm also a salaried worker. So it's fairly heterogeneous. However, everything said and done, on an average, salaried work is something which I aspire for. So let's look at what kind of jobs are being created. This is the phase 2, okay? The phase where in terms of quantity, we were not doing very well. However, the blue line, this upward sloping line, is the share of salaried workers. It was increasing, okay? And the share of self-employed and casual workers was going down. Come phase 3, and what we see is that, hey, the entire increase that we were seeing in the quantity of employment is really being driven by self-employment. That's the self-employment graph, which is upward sloping. Everything else is either stagnating or going down, including salaried job. So the first lens, which we are seeing of quality, does not really reassure us a lot, because the only increase, because the primary increase in employment is coming through the self-employment category. I am going to skip this to save time, but I'm going to move to the second quality lens which we adopt, which is earnings. Because after all, we all work for a livelihood, right? We want to earn money and run our houses, pay our bills. So how do these jobs do when it comes to earnings? First thing, salaried workers are earning, that's the earnings for salaried workers. This is daily income, average daily income in Indian rupees, all real terms, so inflation adjusted. And we are seeing that for salaried workers, significantly higher than the other categories, however, stagnating over time. And this time period is about 7 years period, so it's super significant. For the self-employed workers, which, remember, that's the only category which is actually seeing a rise in terms of numbers, right? Because all our employment growth is being driven by the rise in self-employed workers. Their earnings are stagnating over this entire period. And the only increase we see is that for casual workers, but remember, their earning levels are anyway very, very low. So what we see is, in terms of quantity, the phase where we are in 2017-18 onwards, number of jobs, we are doing super well. But when we talk about the quality of jobs, that's very, very questionable. Now let's come into, let's zoom into women. And we see that this third phase, where we were seeing a rise in the number of employed, it's predominantly driven by female worker participation, female labor force participation, which increased from 23% in 2017-18 to 42% in 2023-24, which is phenomenal. It is very, very remarkable, especially because it is coming after a period of falling female labor force participation. The numbers were actually going down. But look, these all are levels. What about, these all are trends. What about levels? We see a gender gap very much persists, because the female labor force participation rate in 2023-24 continues to be 37 percentage points lower than that for men. And this is official government data, periodic labor force survey. Even within this, the nature of employment remains a concern. Why? Because the share of women in unpaid family work increased from 32% to 37%. Alongside, the share of women in regular wage work, which is salaried work, it fell from 21% to 16%, so about a 5 percentage points drop within the same period. Both these combined present a very sober picture. Now, what we want to ask is that, are women working more because, you know, they have more opportunities and it's a demand-driven growth, the one that I was talking about in the beginning? Or is it simply that more women are entering their market to maintain their household income, you know, just to maintain the bare living standards of their households due to economic pressure? Now, what we know about working women, rise in unpaid help, fall in salaried work. Why is this a cause of concern if it is not a choice? If this unpaid work, if one can say, I'm emphasizing on this because there have been papers which have claimed that, well, women are productive even as unpaid workers, and so why is that a problem for you? They are doing work, they're adding to the household pool, and this is what Professor Diwan, I think, mentioned as income augmenting. And else she can correct me if I did not get that right. But if unpaid work is not a choice, but a binding constraint, that's where we need to stop and question what's happening. What I will be doing now is provide a very simple way. What she mentioned right before me was that by definition, we don't have any estimates of their contribution, right? Because they're unpaid family helpers. So if you look at the data, there is no reported earnings, which is accruing only to them. Of course, the total output of the household is going up, but how much is coming to these unpaid family helpers, we don't know. And that's what we try to do in this paper. I should have mentioned this is joint work with Maitresh Khatak and Jitendra Singh. The paper is out there. Earlier this year it came, but yeah. Okay, so what do we want to do? We really want to understand that these women, or rather, let's just talk about unpaid workers. Unpaid workers, they are contributing. How much is their contribution? Is it a choice which they are making, or does it look as a distress-driven employment outcome? And while for most of us, it will be like, yes, obviously, we still need numbers to convince people. And I think numbers do a very good job in helping us convince people. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is that the unpaid family help is typically associated with a self-employed member. So think of a household, you have a salaried worker, you have a casual worker. There is not much help for an unpaid family helper there. However, the moment you have an own account worker, that's where typically unpaid family help will come in and assist, like the example which I gave earlier. So what we see in the data is in 94% of the cases, an unpaid family helper will be associated with a self-employed member within the household, okay? And how women come in here? Well, if you look at the total working women, look at the total pool of working women, 2/3 of these women are engaged as unpaid helpers. If you look at the total pool of working men, this number stands at less than 8%. So it's largely a woman problem. However, I will stick to talking about unpaid helpers, but I do want you to understand that this is, we are really talking primarily about women. Now, let's talk about only 2 working member households. Okay, so that's going to be our sample. 2 working member households where one person is necessarily an own account worker, which means they are a self-employed person. Okay, and the second person can choose to be any of the other 4. So you can choose to be an own account worker, you can choose to be a casual worker, you can choose to be a salaried worker, or an unpaid helper. So what we get is we get these 4 different types of households, right? So we have one own account worker consistently there, and the other person can kind of choose what to be. And we do this to illustrate that it doesn't look like the unpaid helper is making a choice. Okay. Now, when we have these 4 types of households, we get the average earnings for salaried workers, okay? Average earnings for casual workers, and that's what's reported in these columns. The 3rd and the 4th column are of particular importance because that's where we get the productivity proxied by earnings of the unpaid family helper. So what do we do? Remember, we have 2 member working households, right? And the first member is definitely an unpaid definitely an own account worker. And the second member can choose, right? So let's look at the earnings of that self-employed own account worker if there is no unpaid family helper in the house, okay? And that's what we get. All right. So you were earning 281 rupees if you were a self-employed person in the household without an unpaid family helper. However, if you were a self-employed person in the household with an unpaid family helper, obviously your productivity will be higher. There is no question of zero productivity. And it went up to 333 rupees. Okay. And likewise, we do this for every year. Now, I will argue that the difference between these two can be accrued to that unpaid family helper. So if I assume that these two self-employed workers are the same, they're similar in characteristics on an average, then whatever difference there is in their earnings is really because of the unpaid family helper. And if I do that, that is the estimated earning of unpaid family helper. So you were earning 52 rupees in 2017-18, you went up to 108 rupees in 2023-24, and yet look at the second best option that you had. You were going to make more than double if you chose to be a self-employed worker, which is an own account worker. So it doesn't really seem that, you know, this is a choice which people are making despite having other options. You can come to me and say that, well, that's a strong assumption that you made, that the self-employed people are largely the same with and without unpaid family helpers. So without going into the details, just so you know, we do a propensity score matching, but I will just ask you not to get hassled about any of these other numbers. Just look at these numbers, okay? The specification 4 that I have written. Simply what I've done here, we have controlled for the characteristics of the unpaid family helpers to ensure that they match. Okay, so I'm taking an unpaid family helper without an own account worker without unpaid family helpers, and another own account worker with unpaid family helpers, ensuring that the two own account workers are similar in characteristics. Okay, so their industry, their occupation, their gender, their caste group, their religion, everything is controlled for. Their age, everything is controlled for. So think of really two people who are identical. One has unpaid family help, the other does not have unpaid family help, and I then do the same difference. And we see that in 2023-24, after controlling for everything, an unpaid family helper was making 51 rupees per day. That was the productivity, that was the earnings which was accruing to the unpaid family helper. And just to go back, the alternative, remember, was 262 at the least, and it could go up to 438 if there were enough good opportunities available for these workers around their residence. So what are we really saying? The first thing that I have to say, and perhaps we can talk more about this later in the chat, is that unemployment is not really the best measure to evaluate the labor market. We saw that, that's how I began, right? Unemployment numbers have been going down between 2017-18 and 23-24. But what does that mean? You know, is that, are we only looking to create employment, or are we looking to create good quality jobs which are productivity enhancing, especially for our youth? So we saw that there was a steady rise in the employed since 2017-18. However, quality from both the lenses of employment type, which is, you know, self-employed versus salaried versus casual, as well as from the point of view of earnings, which I would like to believe is the most key critical factor of why we choose to work. Both of these have been worsening over time. We have shown elsewhere that this trend of sending more and more people out to work from within a household, that has been happening at lower earnings. So what that means is that more and more people in the household are going out to work. However, the total household earnings are they're stagnating. Okay, they're remaining the same. So more people are working just to ensure that the total earnings do not fall. Okay, it's not about productive job at all. It appears, and this time with data. Of course, people like both my other panelists have so much of field experience that they see it on an everyday basis. But if you were to convince people based on hard numbers, which they actually believe, these are government data, we see that more women are in the workforce on account of distress. And I am going to repeat this, that if people come and say that, well, unpaid female helpers or unpaid helpers, irrespective of gender, are productive, sure, they are productive. There is no question about that. But the incremental earnings, the incremental productivity is what matters. This is, again, going back to the point which my earlier panelist, Professor Diwan, made about the underemployment aspect. So the employment type of unpaid family helpers does not appear to be a choice by any of the numbers that we have. All the numbers support a signal of increasing crisis. And finally, we make the point, I close by making the point which I made early on, that the increase in total employment over this entire period has been driven disproportionately more in states which are seeing lesser GDP growth. And the nature is that of unpaid helpers, which does not give us a lot to celebrate as we sit today. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Jha, for this wonderful talk. I'm sure there are many questions, which if you have any, you can put it in the chat box. We'll take those later. And I also hope that you talk more about or talk about women's entry, exit, and re-entry pattern into labor force. I would like to know a bit about that later. Moving on to our final panelist, Ms. Radhika Uppal. Radhika is a senior technical specialist of Gender and Development at the International Center for Research on Women, Asia Regional Office. She has 6 years of experience of working with national and international organizations on issues of livelihoods, economic empowerment, and health through a gender intersectional lens. She has experience in qualitative and mixed methods research, monitoring and evaluation, knowledge management, and resource mobilization. Prior to joining ICRW, Radhika worked with organizations such as Population Services International on their flagship program on women's reproductive health, with Azad Foundation conducting research and monitoring their program on non-traditional livelihoods for women, and with Praja Foundation on communication strategies and resource mobilization. She has also worked as an independent consultant with Social Impact on a midterm evaluation. At ICRW, Radhika is working on a project which tests and scales the approaches and intervention to support gender transformative work with NRLM, National Rural Livelihood Mission. Through qualitative research in rural areas of Madhya Pradesh, the project aims to present the strategies and process required to create gender responsive institutions within the MPSRLM. Currently, she is also working on the Rebuild project. The project is about women in the informal economy in Kenya, Uganda, and India, a three-country research to understand the impact of COVID-19 policy responses on women workers in the urban informal economy. We're thankful for Ms. Radhika to join us. Thank you so much, Ms. Radhika. Over to you.
Thank you, Devi. I'll also like to share my screen. Let me know once that's visible.
Sure.
Can you all see my screen?
Not yet. No. Yes, we can see it now.
I've just put it in slideshow. I hope you're able to see that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much to the ResearchWise team for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation. And also thank you for having such great panelists alongside me in this discussion. I will just quickly move on to the next slide. And I think a lot has already been said on this, so I don't think I need to repeat it. The way I had also thought of sort of structuring my conversation and talking points were around how we are seeing the current labor market trends based on the last annual PLFS data round of 23-24. But this we have already discussed. Ritu as well as Manalini have shared fantastic points about the detail of PLFS analysis. So I won't go into much detail of this, just to sort of reiterate that what we are seeing even in government survey data seems to suggest that this is a more of a distress-led growth in female labor force participation rate that we are seeing, because a lot of it has largely happened in increase in self-employment category, and within self-employment, largely majority are still working as unpaid family helper. And we continue to see most of the women workers being informally employed. And we all know that informal employment is more precarious and more vulnerable. So if we look at the larger sort of labor market segmentation, what we also see as from taking on from my last point, that the informal economy in India is where we see women are overrepresented in the informal economy, so which is more prevalent. So women are more in low-paid jobs. These are insecure jobs. There is hardly any access to any sort of social protection measures. We also see a more horizontal segregation when we talk about industries, where again we see women more clustered in certain industries such as care, education, textiles, which are largely not as high growth sectors as we see men in sectors like STEM or manufacturing, etc. But along with the horizontal segregation of where we see women, even the 41.7% women that we see in the labor market, there is also another sort of challenge that women are facing, which is to do with the vertical segregation, where once the women are entering into the labor market, they face more challenges to grow into leadership roles. And those challenges are more structural biases that they face. There are, in certain sectors, they don't even have a clear career progression pathway ahead of them. In sectors where they do have those pathways, it's more difficult for women to grow into senior leadership or even mid-level leadership positions. And the unfortunate reality also is that when we talk about advancement in the economy, we don't have any sort of national data sets around it. So each sector has its own data that sectorally we have looked at, and the numbers vary. So in some sectors, women may be 30% in leadership roles. In some, they may be as low as say 10%, 15% in leadership roles as compared to men. So there is a huge variation when we talk of the vertical segregation, and we don't even have enough data to talk about that once women are entering into the labor market, how are they moving up the career ladder. And again, the other thing I want to highlight is this is also largely for the formal sector, which we saw is very few women are in the formal economy. We see 94% still in the informal economy. And wage gap continues to be a key sort of characteristics of the gendered labor market as we see. As Mrinalini was also referring to the gender gap in earnings earlier, I haven't put here a graph, but we had also looked at the gender gap across the three categories of employment. So self-employment, regular in salary, and casual labor from 17-18 PLFS data to 23-24 PLFS data. And what we also see is the gender gap in earnings is more pronounced among self-employed women, and it has also increased. So women's wage share as share of men was in 17-18 was 0.45, which has actually gone down to 0.33. So what we see between these two slides and from the PLFS data essentially says that there are more women, there is a higher growth in female labor force participation, which is largely driven by increase in the self-employment category. But when we look at the self-employment category, the nature of job that they are more in is unpaid family helper. And even for the rest of the category where they are earning any kind of wage, the gender wage gap has actually increased. So they are earning lesser than men, even within the self-employment category. And these trends do point towards the direction that this seems to be more of a distress-led or a survival strategy that women are employing. And when I come into my next slides, which are also coming a lot more, bringing more insights from our field research, I'll also share how women themselves see their sort of role and position within the economy. So from here, this is, again, in the interest of time, I will not go into much detail into this slide. Essentially, what I was trying to sort of point out is that looking at the labor market macro trends that we see from PLFS, and there are, basis our own field studies, there are a lot of critical gender norm, a lot of critical barriers that women face, both at the level of entry, at the level of advancing in the economy or progressing in the economy, and as well as retention in the economy. And the barriers are multifaceted. There are certain barriers which come from the supply side, where we see unpaid care as a challenge, mobility, restricted mobility being a challenge. There are also certain demand side barriers around hiring bias, lacks of flexibility, and sectoral barriers, women being in sectors which are considered more low value. And over the years, with the platformization, increase in the digital technologies, increase in AI that we are now seeing, the sectoral barriers are further increasing for women. One of the recent research that had come out is also talking about that even within the AI supply chain, we may see women at the bottom of the pyramid, but again, as they are not able to advance so much into the AI workforce as well. And these barriers are sort of working in the larger sphere of the gender norms as well as the legal and policy framework, and those two are intersecting and affecting how these different barriers are affecting women's labor market choices and outcomes both. So if we want to now sort of focus on today's conversations, which is largely around unpaid care work, again, in the beginning also, this was shared how we are looking at the value of unpaid care work. when value in terms of the GDP. So estimates do suggest that women's unpaid domestic and care work in India is ranging between 15 to 17% of GDP. Globally, if we look at global estimates according to ILO suggest that more than 16 billion hours of unpaid care work is being performed daily, which is equivalent to $11 trillion per year. Now, if we very clearly look at how unpaid care work quantitatively comes up as a key critical challenge for women's entry into the labor market, PLFS itself, so the first, within the labor force participation, the first bullet that you all are seeing is from the PLFS data, where 55% of rural women and 63.5% of urban women have reported that childcare and domestic responsibilities are the main reason for them being out of the labor force. According to a WHO report, women who have technical education in medicine, 37% of them are out of the labor force, and around 60% of them actually reportedly are engaged in household work. And this also corresponds to what we have seen and what earlier was also being shared about time use data, that women are spending more hours in unpaid care work, both unpaid domestic work as well as unpaid care work. And conversely, we do see then men spending also more time in employment and women spending less time in paid work opportunities. So even when we look at government's own survey data, it does suggest very clearly, and women have themselves reported, that unpaid care work and unpaid domestic work is a critical reason for them to be out of the labor market. Now, if we look at, because we have done a lot of qualitative studies and we have looked at different sectors. So we have done qualitative studies in formal healthcare sector. We have also looked at the garment supply chain, domestic work, street vending, home-based workers, etc. So multiple informal as well as formal sectors where we have tried to understand qualitatively how does childcare as a subcomponent of the unpaid work, how does that really affects women's labor market outcomes as well as choices. So what we have learned is that at an individual level, it generates a working mother's guilt. They always have that pressure that we have to maintain our work and work-life balance, which puts them under a lot of pressure, affecting their own well-being also. At a family level or at an interpersonal level, there is also oftentimes limited support that is given to women for women's travel, or they are discouraged when they want to take on more responsibilities. And this is true for both when we have tried to look at organizations that work in metro cities as well as organizations that are working in, say, tier 2 or tier 3 cities with a component of rural travel, etc. And oftentimes what we have heard is that if women are trying to join the market, or even if they get more opportunities to grow in an organization, often there is a discouragement that will come from the family, because they will feel that, oh, you have a child to take care of, or we have a lot of household responsibilities to take care of. So they are discouraged to take on more work-related responsibilities. That affects their career progression. That also affects their earnings. That does reflect in the kind of earnings that they are able to get. And at this level, I also want to highlight that care also comes in the shape of community care, because oftentimes there are a lot of community festivals that happen, community events that happen, and in those settings, the onus also comes on women. So it's not just about care at the level of the household, but also at the level of community that often affects their own labor market choices. And we also need to understand that women are not making choices as independent agents. These choices are being made in a complex web of other ecosystem actors that are trying to sort of influence that choice and within which they are making these choices. At an organizational level, if we look at, we have often seen, and it's well researched even in other evidence, etc., that there is hiring bias comes up as a major challenge or as a major manifestation of childcare being a woman's responsibility, specifically childcare being a woman's responsibility. In India, even now, we don't really have a law that makes it illegal to ask questions such as, are you married? Do you plan to have children? When do you plan to have children, etc. So these questions are still being asked. in certain interviews, and this does lead to a hiring bias. And this not just a hiring bias, it also leads to a bias when women are moving into leadership positions, because when they grow into mid-level or senior level roles, often this also comes in a promotion bias as well. And we have also seen that a lot of sort of upskilling opportunities or travel, or if you have to sort of travel, etc., those opportunities of exposure are often given to men and not so much to women. And these decisions are made on behalf of women. It's not that women are asked whether you can do this or not. It is assumed that because a woman has children or younger children at home, they may not be able to travel, and therefore those choices, those opportunities are being given to men within the organization. In the absence of a paternity leave at an organizational level also often creates a barrier. And we have also done studies where we have spoken to men in the organizations to try and understand their perspective around paternity leave. And we have heard that men are willing to take paternity leave if it is available by the organization, and B, if leave by itself will not lead to utilization. So leave along with the supportive work culture will then help in the person availing the paternity leave and being able to spend time at the household with the children, and also help in reducing some of the unpaid work responsibility, childcare responsibilities that fall squarely on women only. And also at an organizational level, there is limited reintegration support that we often see, especially once women are coming back from a maternity break, and if they want to join an organization, very few organizations are providing any kind of support. Often, otherwise, it becomes more difficult for a woman to continue in the organization or to find new opportunities in an organization. And even when they get those opportunities, it often comes at either a lower level or at the same level at which you exited, which also affects your progression, which also affects then what your sort of earning capability is. At a larger structural level, and with structural here, we mean essentially laws, is that in India, we all know there is a maternity leave legislation that is there, and paternity by policy is only available to civil servants and not really a legal mandate in a form of a legal mandate for all sectors. And even the childcare leave that is available for the civil servants is largely only available to women and was recently amended to include single fathers. It is still not available to fathers in general. So it's only available to women or single fathers. So in many ways, even when we look at the level of legislations and policies, is it really also trying to reinforce the idea or the norm that childcare continues to be a woman's responsibility? And that again, to what extent that really affects women's own career progression or their even entry into the labor market is a big question. So now looking at states' accountability, because we were talking about state. So far, what we have essentially seen is from the larger labor market trends that unpaid care is a major reason why women are not in the labor force. Unpaid work, both care and domestic, is a major reason why women are not in the labor force. We have seen that there is a growing gender wage gap. There is a question of, even when women are there, what are the kind of quality of employment women are really entering into. We have seen qualitatively how care often manifests in different ways at different levels to affect women's labor market choices and outcomes. In this situation, state has a key role, as earlier also when Ritu was mentioning that state has a key role to play when it looks at redistributing, reducing the burden of unpaid care. So where does state's accountability lie to address the care inequities? So when we look at this, first thing we really want to reiterate is that state needs to recognize care as a public good. It cannot be seen as a private household issue. We have seen some positive sort of silver linings in terms of some of the recent commitments and discussions that have happened, be it in the G20 Delhi Declaration document, or also there was a LAPSNA roundtable that was held last year on making around women at work, in which care as a labor market, investing in care ecosystem as a labor market enabler was one of the key points that was being highlighted by LAPSNA and MOLE. And with the time use surveys becoming more, having its second round now, and hopefully we'll have another round coming up in the future, these are signals in a way that the government is recognizing that unpaid work is an impediment for women's labor market entry, sustenance, and progression. They are thinking of certain policies, but we still need much greater fiscal investments, clarity, and commitment on some of these, on translating some of these commitment into actual policies and actual strategies which can really help women reduce their burden of unpaid work. So one, there is a need for a larger sort of umbrella national care policy, which in some other countries we have seen come up, that looks at care holistically, that also look at solutions more holistically. So looking at care from an infrastructure point of view, financing for care, also looking at care from the lens of a larger care economy where paid care workers are also a part of it. Second is there is a need for expansion of public childcare centers.
In the interest of time, can I humbly request you to wrap up in the next 5 to 7 minutes? Thank you.
Yes, I'll wrap in the next 2 minutes. So there is a need for expansion of public childcare and elderly care centers. There are estimates that the demographic dividend that we now see will inverse by 2050, and we'll have more elderly population. And with the family structures becoming more nuclear, there is a need to invest also in elder care support. And it's more about support and not necessarily center. It could look like more home care support. And in our other studies, we have seen when it comes to utilization of childcare services, accessibility, it's affordable, accessibility to either home or the work site, it's affordability and quality are key drivers for families to make a choice of sending their children to childcare, and including in formal or informal and rural and urban spaces. Third is engaging with civil society can be a great solution forward, because there are a lot of CSOs that are already working in the communities and bringing more context-specific solutioning. So there can be more government and CSO partnership. Regulatory reforms such as looking at parental or paternity leave, which are non-transferable paternity leave, flexible work for all and not just for women, and anti-discrimination laws could be also a great way forward. Recognizing and investing in paid care workers in their skilling, in recognizing them in national surveys, access to social protections is a key, could be a key enabler and is much needed. And lastly, when we talk about recognition, reduction, redistribution, investing in redistribution of care by trying to engage more men into these conversations is also something we have seen work in some of the CSO work that is happening around male engagement towards care. And perhaps that can also be a great way to redistribute care and create more shared and gender equitable households. With that, I'll stop. Yes, back to you, Devi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. I'm so sorry I had to rush you, but I'm sure we have a bit of time for discussion where you could discuss more about some of those things. We have heard from 3 wonderful panelists, and we have a lot of footing to start the discussion. The stage is now open for discussion. So we have some questions in the chat box, and we have got some questions in our Google form as well. So if anybody in the audience would like to ask something, I request you to raise your hand so that I can select some of you. And meanwhile, I also request you to keep your questions short and to the point so that we can save some time. Let me just read out some questions in the chat box for the time being. There is a question from Suroshri Nath, who's a PhD scholar from Presidency University. I suppose the question is addressed to Professor Ritu. She made an observation that the elderly care, a form of unpaid work, isn't explicitly captured under codes 92 or 93. And she would like to know whether this omission could lead to underestimation of women's unpaid work. And if so, how can we address this data gap to accurately reflect unpaid care responsibilities?
Shall we take all questions together? What do you suggest? I don't know how many there are. Anyway, what he has raised is a very short answer, that it has not been incorporated the way it should have been incorporated at all. So, and I think this becomes extremely important in the context of the fact that particularly in rural areas, all the primary health centers are closing down and they're being moved to taluka or even district. So the issue of care of the elderly and also the ill becomes something which really needs to be focused on. Huge underestimation, absolutely. Totally agree.
There are 2-3 more questions in the chat box which are not specifically addressed to any one panelist, so anybody can answer. So I'm just going to read them out. There's a question from Rahul who would like to know what the government of India is doing to empower women in informal sector and why the representation of women is decreasing in gig work. There's another question by Shubham, who is also a PhD scholar, and he would like to know how the impact of social and community norms in slum areas influence the withdrawal of women from the paid labor force into unpaid domestic labor, and if we can address this issue in different industrial segments. So anybody from the panel could answer this question.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
No, Ranani, you go ahead. And then
I came to say that it has to be you. So please go ahead. Yeah.
This is in fact what I presented about 2-3 years ago, the issue of gig workers, and in our labor conference, and something I've been working on for some time, and listed out. I mean, it's a huge question. They will not come because of there are many issues. In fact, I've listed out some. I think 79 reasons or obstacles why women cannot stay and platform work. I'm not talking about gig because the definition of gig is very different. So if it is app oriented, I mean, simple things, the issue of whether you own a smartphone independently, can you get a driver's license? Can you afford? Because platform work means that the means of production belong to the worker and not to the employer. So can the women afford to get a two-wheeler or get the money to rent? The issues of safety. I mean, there are just many. I can share the thing with you later on, and maybe you can circulate that link.
I'll just add one point to what Ritu said. Yes, in another study, another major barrier that had come with and platform work, again, not gig but app-based platform work, is a huge input cost that a lot of these platforms are also expecting women to put in. So if it is, for instance, beauty work,
yes, exactly.
The expectation is for you to buy their products, you to invest, have some upfront cost that you have to put in, and women don't have that kind of resources. So it becomes very difficult. And also digital literacy is again a major challenge. A lot of women are not very comfortable with technology. So creating, having access to smartphones, then actually having the know-how and comfort of using it. And we also have to be very mindful of the increase in financial scams that have happened over the last many years that has made women even more uncomfortable of using app-based platforms and app-based work. So I think that is also a major impediment for women specifically.
Yeah, there are two other reasons, which I think we really need to research much more. And that is not only for women, but for all. One is what Radhika mentioned, the financial literacy. How do you calculate your earnings? Depreciation on the means of production, the rent component, etc., etc. Second is a fiscal literacy. All the earnings which the gig platform workers get have TDS cut. Now, how do you get your TDS back? Because you're not in the 2 lakh category or whichever category where you have to pay taxes. So there are many issues which are involved in this. I think, when you were saying, Radhika, buy your own products, recently there was a 10-minute clause was removed, right? And Swiggy and Blinkit all have these t-shirts with 10 minutes, right? They had to change the t-shirts. All the workers were forced to buy new t-shirts from the aggregators at 150 rupees each. That's the level of, I think, appropriation of their earnings.
Yeah.
which are there.
I'll just add one very quick point because this is linked to the unpaid work.
Yeah.
What we have also seen is a lot of time platforms try to attract women by offering flexibility.
Yeah.
In practice, there's no flexibility because the demand comes in the hours when women have to spend time with children or at household work. And if you are not doing it, you will be downgraded to a level, you will be penalized, your IDs may be blocked.
Oh, yes.
So that is a major challenge. Like flexibility is a major problem. While it is shown as an attractive proposition, in reality, that's not the case. And they end up dropping out.
Yeah, and in fact, this whole thing of work from home. I mean, how does a construction worker work from home? It applies to just a very small amount. There's another thing of, many illustrations of the unpaid work component, okay, which applies to many others. But now that the platform issue has come up, is the waiting time, right? You have to wait for orders. So whether it's 10 minutes or 2 hours or 4 hours, that has to be calculated in your level of, what we call surplus appropriation, or whichever way you may say it, earnings reduction. Nalini is the expert on the earnings issue. So when you do,
No, I'm glad Radhika actually mentioned the flexibility.
calculations, please take waiting time into account.
Yeah, if only the data would allow us, we do the best.
There's no data.
But it's all about, yeah.
There is no data.
We can think of the numbers as the lower bound. As the upper bound. It will get further below than what has been calculated. That's what we can actually put as a caveat. That if you just look at the money component, that's what you have. But the waiting time, as you're rightly saying, will make it further lower. And Radhika, thanks for actually bringing in the flexibility aspect, because the question that was asked, that why is there a fall in numbers, female workers in gig and platform work. First of all, I'm not sure where the numbers are coming from, but if there is a fall, yeah, a very big reason could be that it's not suitable. It's not the flexibility thing is just it's something to attract you and bring you in. Yeah.
In fact, the number of women workers in platform, I couldn't find when I was researching for my paper. So finally, I went to the Gig Workers Union, and they had the numbers of 4,800 in India, which they know is an understatement, itself. But that's the national figure which we've got. I think there's somebody who's upset that his question is not being taken up.
If anybody from the audience would like to ask questions,
Women who work
pull your camera or raise your hand. Meanwhile, I'll take a question that we got from our Google form, which these questions were asked by faculty.
Adrita Roy, somebody called Adrita Roy.
Miss Roy can unmute herself and ask.
Otherwise, I can take her question. Before that, let me just read a question that we got, which is about climate justice. So I think it is something you could share insight on. So the question is, the discourse on just transition in climate policy rarely accounts for women's unpaid care work. How can we reframe just transition as a genuinely gender just transition, one that recognizes and redistributes care work while embedding women's knowledge and agency in climate planning? So if any of the panelists could share thoughts on unpaid care work and climate justice.
I don't see things, I'm sorry, but I don't see things, the issue of climate change as something which has just suddenly come out in the last few years. It is a result of environmental degradation over a period of time and what has been done. In fact, that's why things like common property resources, etc., etc. So I don't, in fact, even where the gender component, to some level, just read the first chapter of Ramchandra Guha's book on the environment. And I think that whole logic, women, of course, worst affected, as we know. So, but you dump them with the responsibility of maintaining climate. And this thing is not fair. They're the worst affected. I think that's where the role of the Indian state comes in. And that's why I'm so glad with your title, research-wise. You're really wise in doing that.
I'll take some more questions from the chat. Adrita would like to know about, she asked about women who work as below the line worker in media production and would like to have some opinion on that. Another question is by Rukmini, who wanted to ask, how can the judiciary of India support menstrual leaves for working women without completely rejecting it? So I guess these are wonderful questions if any of the panelists would like to answer.
What to say about the judiciary? They don't recognize Asha and Anganwadi workers as workers. Right? They do it. Marital rape is not recognized as rape. So where is menstrual work going to be subliminal? I mean, I just don't know how many illustrations to give. I mean, Radhika and Mrinal. Judiciary, I can go on because Indra Jaising and I work a lot on it together and we bring out a daily bulletin on what goes on in the judiciary. So I mean, don't ask me to talk on that. It'll be till tomorrow that I can talk.
I've got another question, which is about how we can integrate the unpaid care work into national income accounting. So we do see a lot of studies that measures the unpaid work and kind of monetizes it, but can we really incorporate that into an economic model? And also how far or how effective, or do you even think that paying women for their unpaid work as a monthly payment, what are your thoughts on that? So some governments are proposing that we'll give some amount of money for women since they are doing unpaid home domestic work. So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I think it's just reinforcing the divide. This debate is an old debate. We've had it for some 20, 30 years. And again, it came up very recently about wages for housework. I think there was a Madras High Court which had raised it, and then later on several others. It's just reinforcing it, that you stay at home, you continue doing the work, and here is a little bit of money, which is all your Behna schemes are partly that at some level. It's like having a Ministry of Women and Child. I mean, I've been opposing it for 40 years, 30 years, whenever it started. Why? It should be just Ministry of Women separate and Ministry of Children separate. Because again, you're doing, reinforcing again the stereotype. So care comes up in women's issues, but it never comes up in other employment issues.
Yeah, I just want to agree with what Ritu said, because if these policies, as we are seeing now, the narrative is that, okay, at least you're being paid for the work that you're doing. But that's not the point. That was never the point of the argument to begin with.
Exactly.
And if we are trying to ask for also reduction, redistribution, monetizing and payment is not the solution.
Yeah,
that cannot be.
Yes.
And how do you, one is also just a question of how do you even monetize it? Which is the standard, what is the uniformity that you start with? But even more important are these political questions of reinforcing the idea that it will still be women's work, and now at least you're being paid, so you should stop asking questions of redistribution. So I think we need to be very mindful of also the kind of questions that we ask and the kind of debates that we hold, and what is the end goal post for us. Like, it can't stop at accounting, it can't stop at coming at percentages of GDP or putting a monetary value. At the end, it needs to reduce women's work, it needs to be redistributed so women are able to participate more actively in the economy. So we need to be clear of the final sort of goal also here.
I must use the word aspirations as well, that women's aspirations, along with the political aspect, even the social aspect. As we speak, we're doing a survey of rural households in Sonipat, Haryana. And it's fascinating. We hear these, we were doing focus group discussions and with both men and women. And the men would say that, we used to have cattle in our houses. Everybody used to have cattle. And protein intake was not a problem. We didn't have to go out and buy the milk, etc., milk products. And now they say that women don't want to do that work anymore because, you know, it's dirty work. Cattle have moved inside the house, so kacha sadak nahi hai, and because of that, the smell is overpowering, etc. And they say the young girls who come in as, you know, our daughter-in-laws, the young brides, they refuse to do it, even though the money which was, you know, whatever little money you make from it was supposed to be the woman's income. And if the woman is refusing to do that, you need to understand the aspirational component has also gone up. And just by making them, you know, paying for their housework, I think there is unanimity in the panel that that's not something that we would advocate for.
Yeah.
Another question is by Gopika. So she would like to know, she was saying that the unpaid domestic can be seen as income augmenting and income substitution. So can you please elaborate on the income substitution part?
Oh, there's quite a lot, but if you see the PLFS and the time use studies, etc., you know, simple thing like grinding masala. All right, so you buy the whole thing and you grind it. So that would become, in a way, income substituting. You know, substituted by your labor. Or growing few vegetables, getting the fruits from trees nearby. All that is income. So you don't spend money. Spend any income on doing it. Fuel, that's another issue. And that's becoming a huge issue. There are just many illustrations, but I think these would be anything to add, Radhika, Mrinan?
No, I think that's all. Yeah, the distinction between augmentation and substitution is important. I think that's the focus. I mean, one should remember that. But yeah, nothing else to add.
Augmenting is what you were saying, no? Cutting the onions, etc.,
Yeah, exactly.
That becomes the augmenting component.
Yeah.
Or the dhobi's wife who does the ironing and the dhobi goes out and does. So that's the augmenting component.
We have a question from Vipasha. Can you unmute yourself and ask the question? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for all your presentations. It was really informative. And my question is more like, I had this thought that when we talk about state taking the responsibility of care provisions, so could there be a possibility that when these provisions like they come out by the government, and it could obviously create job possibilities, but could it be a possibility that it could attract mostly women workers, and there could, how do we determine the wages, and if the wages are not substantial enough, would it be limited to it being more feminized? And if the wages are increased, then could it be a possibility that there could be a gradual male takeover in this area? So I just had that sort of conundrum. So thank you.
Yes. So Adrita is repeating her question, which is on, she works on gender in labor and media production. So she would like to know why the workers in media production is less and why the participation is less in these areas, and how it will change.
Media means which media? I don't know. OTT or what?
Adrita, could you clarify on that? Your question wasn't clear the first time. If you can unmute. Screen industry.
Maybe a one line. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. First of all, I don't know what this work is, so I won't give a specific answer. But a generic answer to both the questions would be that we need to distinguish. Anyway, there's a lot of literature. I'm not the first one to be talking about this. That we need to distinguish between the supply side and the demand side constraints of female participation. You know, there is so much focus on the supply side constraints, and by supply side we mean that how do we increase women's how do we increase more women workers entering the labor force from their end, not from the end of the employers, which means that you increase their education, you attack the gender norms, you make their flexibility, the mobility easy, and that will kind of encourage them to enter the market. all of that is done to a large extent. The cross enrollment rates for men and women have closed, and the kind of improvements we have seen in education for women is phenomenal. Quality remains a concern across the board, but let's not go there. In terms of numbers, we have closed the gap. Yeah, Aditya, I understand women who work behind the camera. It's just that I think you need to also make work flexible for women to enable women to step out of their house and do that. There has been so much discussion in this panel on the kind of work which women do inside the houses, right? So to have that flexibility with childcare, with elderly care, with the household chores, to step out, do that job and come back in, there can be demand side constraints. If the work will permit, women will step out and do that work. There is enough evidence to support that. But the nature of work has to complement the kind of work which women are looking for. That's my generic answer, because I have no idea. I'm sorry for on the kind of work, what it entails. But if others on the panel have, maybe they can come in.
Screen industry, camera, editing, ADs. I mean, these are the standard things. And a large number of ADs are women, very much so. Camera few, but the conditions of work are very different. And also it was considered a very male-oriented thing. So when you have one woman editor, I mean, everyone's writing about her. But if it was a norm, no one would even think of, gendering that context.
Yeah. Also, it's to do with the nature of the work that,
Yeah.
and that comes from the production of the film, which the schedule is such. So oftentimes when the nature is such, it gets, and there are very few women, as Ritu said, it's largely male, still a male-dominated space. Bargaining becomes even more difficult. I'm also not an expert on this sector per se, but I think in Kerala, the Women Artists Association, I'm forgetting their name, they have tried to do some work around collectivizing women in the film industry and leveraging that collective voice to talk about changes in the work practices. Perhaps that could be a case to look at of how did that collectivization happen that led to better recognition, visibility, and hopefully some bargaining that they might have been able to do.
Right.
I hope that answers your question, Adrita. In the interest of time, we'll wrap the question and answer now. If there are any more questions, you can always reach out to the panelists via mail. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer you. We'll wrap in a while. So I request Mr. Pankaj Patel, lead research strategist of the ResearchWise, to deliver the official vote of thanks. And also, I humbly request everybody to stay back for 5 seconds after the vote of thanks to take a quick snap of this whole meeting. Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Pankaj.
So I'll be very quick. Thank you, Devi. I'll be very quick because already we are ahead of time, the set time. Where to start? I mean, I prepared a speech, but I'm not going to read that. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ritu ma'am, Rinalli ma'am. I think I'm already getting messages that it's already, we are way ahead of time. Radhika ma'am, thank you so much. I mean, it was very, the prompt reply I got, not very prompt from Ritu ma'am, but others I got. Oh, so thank you so much.
Northeast with no connectivity for 3 weeks.
Yeah, she was busy. She said that she was visiting the Northeast, I guess.
Yeah.
And yesterday I saw that Mrinalli ma'am attending some conference. I saw some post on Twitter. So I mean, all our panelists are too busy, and that's why we kept little away from that 8th March, because I thought that a lot of panel discussion and invitation comes around those dates, when 1 week later and 1 week prior also. So we kept it on 22nd. It's Eid also, and happy Eid or Eid Mubarak those who are celebrating. Thank you so much.
Mubarak. Also Navroz.
Yeah, Navroz too. A lot of festival. I think this Hindu Navbars and that new different languages they are celebrating new. Gudi Padwa was 2 days back, I guess. So thank you.
Amazing.
Yes, ma'am. It was really wholesome and comprehensive, insightful, and we will look forward again, like Ritu ma'am told in the beginning, that 15 minutes is not enough. Completely agree, ma'am. We will have one more discussion maybe on Labor Day or something. It will be full day or full panel discussion only with you. And So I would like to thank all those who registered and participated, all participants, special invitee from JNU, TIS, and other universities. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, the Research Wise team, my two boys, Disant and Santanu, for helping me out. Devi, you were brilliant today. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you